In this, the 18th lesson of the course, we examine the responses to the new economics by economists and others who continue to trust in market forces and challenge the need for an expanded government role. Not every economist came to terms with the Keynesian demand management policies sweeping through their discipline. In addition to critics such as Harry Gunnison Brown, defending the arguments presented by Henry George, were representatives of the non-interventionist school of thought. This group included as its premier spokesperson the economist Ludwig von Mises. Von Mises was born in what is today the Ukraine. While still very young, the family moved to Vienna, and Ludwig eventually studied at the University of Vienna. In 1934, he sought refuge in Geneva, Switzerland, where he remained until 1940. Fearing the prospect of Germany taking control over Switzerland, he joined other Jewish refugees and emigrated to the United States. He soon became a visiting professor at New York University. His research as an economist focused on the causes of business cycles. He concluded that an unsound expansion of credit was the primary cause. A firm believer in markets, von Mises was convinced that socialism could not be sustained because of the impossibility of establishing government agencies capable of organizing a complex economy. In an address delivered before the American Academy of Political and Social Science in March of 1945, he also challenged the Keynesians on their interpretation of the facts. He stated, "The exact diagnosis of the economic evils of our age is, we have outlived the short run and are suffering from the long run consequences of policies which did not take them into consideration." Von Mises was responding to the oft-quoted statement by John Maynard Keynes that, quote, "in the long run, we are all dead." It is worth taking a moment to put this statement by Keynes into its original context. Keynes was reacting to an assertion by Irving Fisher that in the long run, monetary inflation has no ill effects on an economy. Keynes responded, "Now, in the long run, this is probably true, but this long run is a misleading guide to current affairs. In the long run, we are all dead. Economists set themselves too easy, too useless a task if in tempestuous seasons they can only tell us that when the storm is long past, the ocean is flat again." Ludwig von Mises offered a very different diagnosis of what caused the Great Depression. The interventionists have silenced the warning voices of the economists, but things developed precisely as these much abused orthodox scholars had predicted. Depression is the aftermath of credit expansion. Mass unemployment, prolonged year after year, is the inextricable effect of attempts to keep wage rates above the level which the unhampered market would have fixed. What von Mises was reminding anyone who would listen is that unemployment would disappear when wages fell to levels employers could afford to pay and still maintain desired profit margins. Absent government payments to the unemployed, workers would take whatever was offered so long as they could meet their most basic needs. One major problem with the perspective offered by von Mises was that governments had always been interventionist, but on behalf of landed and other monopolistic interests rather than the general population. As Martin Luther King Jr. would later observe, "We all too often have socialism for the rich and rugged free market capitalism for the poor." Another strong defender of the market economy was Friedrich Hayek, born in Vienna, Austria. After earning doctorates in law and political science in 1921 and 1923 respectively, Hayek founded and served as director of the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research before joining the faculty of the London School of Economics in 1931. Hayek joined von Mises in the campaign to challenge Keynesian doctrines. He wrote, "I cannot help regarding the increasing concentration on short-run effects not only as a serious and dangerous intellectual error, but as a betrayal of the main duty of the economist and a grave menace to our civilization." He continued, "The aim and effect of 200 years of continuous development of economic thought have essentially been to lead us away from the more superficial monetary mechanism and to bring out the real forces that guide long-run development." Added to the perspectives offered by von Mises and Hayek came the teachings of Milton Friedman. After earning his doctorate in 1946 from Columbia University, Friedman began teaching at the University of Chicago. Friedman believed another depression was made impossible by structural changes in attitudes and to institutions, banking in particular. He probably would not have wanted to be reminded of his forecast concerning the banking industry. Early on he wrote, "Federal deposit insurance has made bank failures almost a thing of the past. A bank no longer fails when it has been badly managed and its assets fall short of its liabilities." Friedman could look upon the following quarter century as remarkably stable for the financial services sector, but this stability was not to last. The global economic system proved to be inherently weak and unable to deal with the numerous shocks to come, not the least of which was the attempt by the owners of oil-bearing lands to extract higher and higher rents from producers and consumers. Poorly thought-out deregulation, poorly timed, almost destroyed the U.S. savings banks. Early on, Friedman expressed his great concern over the government's policy of controlling the dollar price of gold. Friedman argued, "The fixed U.S. buying price for gold, rather than being the kingpin of its monetary structure, is in the same class as the fixed buying price for domestically produced wheat. Gold is a storable commodity for which there is a rigid support price. The only difference is that the gold program is also part of our foreign economic aid." The lesson he tried to teach was that price supports have negative externalities. Some benefit, some are harmed. Politics dictates who benefits and who is harmed. This graph tells the story. The subsidy comes from the taxpayers generally. The benefits accrue to some consumers and to producers. Business journalism also produced many critics of Keynesian interventionist and demand management policies. Henry Hazlitt, libertarian in his views, edited the Freeman, contributed to the Wall Street Journal, and authored numerous books, including The Failure of the New Economics, published in 1959. Hazlitt took nearly 500 pages to fully respond to Keynes. He wrote, "I have been unable to find in it a single important doctrine that is both true and original. What is original in the book is not true, and what is true is not original. In fact, even much that is fallacious in the book is not original, but can be found in a score of previous writers." What is also true is that neither Henry Hazlitt nor John Maynard Keynes acknowledged just how important were property markets, and land markets more specifically, as drivers of repeating cycles of boom to bust. Almost alone, the University of Wisconsin supported research in land economics. Edward C. Harwood, on the other hand, built a successful investment consulting service in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, based on a rigorous analysis of all market forces, land markets included. Harwood's initial research into the business cycle was published in 1932, and by 1955 he felt compelled to take on the analysis of mainstream economics. He wrote, "Many writers of economics textbooks have given only superficial consideration to the potential effects of a tax on site values as differentiated from a tax on value of improvements." In a brief but clear discussion of this point, Professor Paul Samuelson describes how a tax on site values would fall in its entirety on those privileged to hold exclusive titles to such sites, and would not burden either those who labor or those who invest in the reproducible capital of our economy. An obvious conclusion is that shifting of the tax burden from investors and earners would encourage new investment as well as the processes of production, and would inhibit the speculative withholding of valuable sites and resources from production. That the net result could be more rapid economic growth, with output more equitably distributed among those who participate in the productive processes, seems equally clear. A year later, he founded the American Institute for Economic Research in Great Barrington and offered his investment advice to clients. Uniquely, Harwood was one of a handful of business cycle theorists to examine land markets as distinct from the markets for labor, for capital goods, for credit, and for equities. Harwood became a vocal critic of what most economics professors were teaching in the universities. He wrote, "Any student who takes the classical demand and supply curves to the mathematics department of his college will learn that the point where the theoretical supply and demand curves cross is without significance, because 3 rather than 2 variables necessarily are involved. Time, the sometimes unmentioned third variable, cannot be disposed of in practice, and 2 equations involving 3 variables are still insoluble. Nevertheless, probably thousands of undergraduates are being required to learn what, to mathematicians, obviously is nonsense." Also noteworthy were the libertarian and free market writings of Murray Rothbard, a New Yorker who earned a BA degree in mathematics and economics in 1945 from Columbia University and a doctorate degree in 1956. His thinking was strongly influenced by the lectures of Ludwig von Mises, not merely on the merits of free markets, but as they championed the principles of a free society. Regarding the responsibilities of the economist, Rothbard wrote, "The economist is obliged to inquire into the conditions and the nature of the property ownership that would obtain in the free society. If a free society means a world in which no one aggresses against the person or property of others, then this applies a society in which every man has the absolute right of property in his own self and in the previously unowned natural resources which he finds, transforms by his own labor, and then gives to or exchanges with others." Thus, Rothbard takes a somewhat confusing position alongside those who claim by right of discovery or right of first occupancy the earth and its natural resources. The situation in which Rothbard would leave for later generations, when all or nearly all of the useful area of the earth is claimed, is to greatly advantage those who benefit by inheritance of landed property, while others would be compelled to pay rent to the landed and taxes to government. With respect to the moral question of whether individuals ought to be able to claim and monopolize portions of the earth, Rothbard rejected the perspective advanced by Henry George. Rothbard wrote, "One of the first things to be said about the Georgist theory is that it calls attention to an important problem, the land question. Current economics tends to treat land as part of capital and to deny the existence of a separate land category at all. In such an environment, the Georgist thesis serves to call attention to a neglected problem, even though every one of its doctrines is fallacious." Rothbard's moral sense is rather different from that held by Henry George. Here he refers to George's position in response to the societal right of eminent domain. Many advocates of eminent domain contend that society has the right to use any land for its purposes. They have thus conceded the validity of a major Henry George's plank, that every person, by virtue of his birth, has a right to his aliquot share of God-given land. Actually, however, since society does not exist as an entity, it is impossible for each individual to transfer his theoretical aliquot right into real ownership. Actually, what Henry George reminded us of is that none of us can exist without access to nature and what nature provides. Thus, access to nature, to the earth, must be the equal birthright of all persons. The question then is how to ensure under the laws of any society that this birthright is secured. There's no practical way to divide the earth into shares that provide equality of opportunity to all. The most practical solution, Henry George concluded, was to recognize the rent fund as societal property, collected in lieu of taxes, to pay for public goods and services as would occur if the community offered to lease public land to the highest bidder. Alana Hartzog, who has worked tirelessly around the globe to educate people on the merits of Henry George's solution to the land question, writes, "The supply of land is fixed while the demand for it is growing. Owners of land, collectively, have a monopoly over a scarce resource which everybody needs, but which costs them nothing to produce. They are charging the rest of us for the use of this resource. The object of land value taxation is to ensure that any payment for this resource goes to society as a whole, rather than into the bank accounts of landowners and mortgage lenders." Also worthy of mention is Victor Zarnowitz, who in 1939 fled Poland to escape the Nazi invasion and was then sent to a Siberian labor camp by Soviet authorities. Repatriated after the Second World War, he earned his doctorate in economics from the University of Heidelberg in 1951. The following year, he emigrated to the United States and joined the economics faculty of the University of Chicago. His work on business cycles brought him also to doubt the value of much of the mathematics introduced into economics. Contrary to some critics, there are no indications that U.S. forecasts have grown systematically worse, that is, less accurate, more biased, or both. Neither do any definite trends in a positive direction emerge from comparisons of forecasts and time series projections for the principal aggregative variables. Major failures of forecasting are related to the incidence of slowdowns and contractions in general economic activity. Forecasters tend to rely heavily on the persistence of trends in spending, output, and the price level. Which leaves us with the question of whether economists during these years provided very constructive advice to political decision makers. Absent the economists, would there have been another Great Depression after the Second World War? Or would freer market economies have brought the world decades of sustained, non-inflationary economic improvement? Or, as I believe is the case, does the absence among most economists of appreciation for the full power of land markets doom them to failure? We have reached the end of Lesson 18.